The education perspective on today's stuff, and it's really interesting coming on now and having listened to the two speakers before and how it's going to link in. Hopefully, that's the plan anyway. But I quite often sort of go into the kitchen and wonder how I got there. That's kind of a bit how I feel right now, to be honest. But I am confident of one thing, and that is I will outperform the air conditioning. So if we go from there, My background is, and I'll touch on this in a minute, I was a primary teacher, then a secondary teacher. I wasn't particularly good at either of those things to start with, and then I ended up working within what was then EBD, or Naughty Boys School, which then took the journey from EBD to social emotional behavioural difficulties. We then got some girls, and that made life very interesting. And then we moved to social emotional mental health. And when we moved there, that was a very difficult time for some of our staff who had been doing things a certain way. And then we were in a position then where you had to understand where the behaviour was originating from. And that was me down the rabbit hole. And it's a rabbit hole I've never gotten out of. So I'm still learning every day, but hopefully we can look at how we can bring some of those things into schools.
Thanks, Graham. So one of the things I was interested in asking you first of all is what, in the story you started to unpack there about your Genesis work, what did you notice about how you used to work? What epiphanies did you have that brought you to where you are?
Well, I'd had a very traditional initial teacher training. I'd got the message about being an authority figure and about behaviour management and that kind of message. And then I'd gone into my first role, which was teaching year 4, so not 8-9-year-olds, and I was trying to be this robotic authority figure that would have excellent behaviour management in the classroom, and it just failed miserably. And the children were miserable, and I was miserable, and the behaviour wasn't very good. And I'd got to a point where, in my head, I'd decided that teaching wasn't for me, and I was going to leave. And when I made the decision that that was me done, I sort of relaxed a little bit. And it was at a time when you could get a little bit of extra money if you ran clubs. That would be a novel concept now, but that was where we were at then. And so if I was due to be unemployed, I thought I need to get a few extra quid in the bank. So I started doing 3 clubs. And then I started doing these clubs, and all of a sudden, the children that I had in the club started behaving far better in the classroom, and the penny still hadn't quite dropped at that point in time. But then I relaxed a bit because I was going to leave anyway, and so my demeanour relaxed a little bit in the classroom, and then everybody's behaviour started getting better, and I started to have a different relationship with my young people, and they started to see a more human side to me, and vice versa, and everything just got better. So I decided that primary wasn't for me, but I thought maybe I'll give secondary a go, and I moved to secondary, and I started to teach PE in secondary schools. And then following on from that, I found that children that other people didn't want to work with, I was having lots of success with. And I thought, well, it must be because I'm teaching PE, but then actually, if it's because I'm teaching PE, why is it when I've got a maths cover and English cover, that child is behaving better for me than they do for their normal teacher? So that's the point where the penny actually dropped. And then I realised back then how I actually managed to get through my teacher training in the first place. And the reason I got through my teacher training in the first place was because of the person I did my teaching practice with. Not the teacher, my fellow trainee, who's now an executive head teacher in Wales, Jamie Hallett, and he would drag me out on yard every yard time and make me interact with the kids and play, and he would have me in a position where we'd have a bit of a laugh and a joke. And then we were at a time when we actually had a school residential, and the children see you in a different light in that, and you build all that cultural capital outside of the classroom that then, when you're in the classroom, makes the children feel safer in your presence. And that's sort of the journey I went on, and that's my big epiphany. And I was probably a bit late to the party, if I'm honest, but I've tried to make up for that since then.
Thanks, Graham. And I guess just reflecting on what you were saying, there's a common theme, isn't there, we've heard about today. It's about being human, relational, understanding people in their context, building empathy. Thank you. So I'm sure people want to know more about the work. So tell us more about the work that you do. Tell us about your grand theory.
Grand theory. A lot of what I talk about is one of the messages that I can't stand is the managing behaviour message that we often hear in schools, and I try to reframe that with schools I'm working with to talk about teaching behaviour, because if you look at all of the work that goes on in schools and all of the different subjects, the maths lessons, the English lessons, the PE lessons, whatever it is, the learning comes from the mistakes that children are allowed to make. And you won't do a piece of English without correcting the punctuation, correcting the grammar. You won't do maths without, doing a maths test and getting 20 out of 20 teaches children nothing. We want them to get some of those questions wrong so we can look at where it's gone wrong and then we can improve going forward. But the attitude towards behaviour is that children just know how to do it, and then we're going to punish them for doing it wrong and expect that to motivate them to do it right. Now, if we're looking through a trauma-informed lens, we're making the assumption there that children are in control of that behaviour all the time and that they are choosing to misbehave, and that's a really dangerous assumption that is too commonplace in education. So my the way I've looked at it is, if you go into an SEMH setting like mine was, you will find, and I know we're trying to avoid the labels and things, but you will find children with different processing difficulties. You'll find autistic young people. You'll find children that got diagnosis of ADHD, although I try and, rather than that, I talk about children having underdeveloped frontal cortex would be the way I would approach that. But there could be a dozen different reasons as to why that child is struggling. And within that dozen, there's probably a little cocktail going on, and then we label them as complex needs, and they don't fit within any of the neat boxes in any of those things to get any kind of diagnosis. So you just have a child that comes and they're just badly behaved. And in my 15 years working in that, there weren't any that were just badly behaved. There was always a reason as to why that was coming about. So trying to figure out how to approach that and trying to get staff to look at it from a perspective of seeing a distressed child rather than a child that's misbehaving, we've got to try and look at where it comes from rather than the end point. And what we do in schools so much is firefight. We wait for the behaviour, we respond to the behaviour. And if we're doing that, then we're either going to approach it with a firefighting approach that brings more fire, and then we just get more fire, or we bring you water and we put the fire out. But if we then take that child and we work on regulating them, we work on supporting them, we talk through, we do some emotional coaching with them, we look at the behaviour from a perspective of how can we repair the action, how can we learn going forwards, and what can we do as a plan, then not only do we teach the child how to behave better for next time, but we're also changing that child's experiences of their adults. And if a child has come into a situation where they've been in a household, for example, where they've never felt safe, they've never felt cared for, they've not been interacted with, they're coming into school expecting the same things, they're going to have feelings of low self-esteem and frustration and anger at that situation. That's going to drive behaviours that are aggressive or avoidant or defiant or whatever we want to label them as. Now, if we invest the time in them, if we work with them, we work to co-regulate them and all those different things, then not only do we prevent the escalation in the behaviour, but we change that child's experiences and feelings. And if we change the feelings to adults do care about me, adults do keep me safe, adults do want me here, adults do believe I can be successful, then the feelings are different. They're more optimistic. We've got some resilience there. We've got some hope. We've got some optimism. We'll have automatically different behaviours without making behaviour the focus. And that's hard because it goes completely against those initial teacher training messages, a very behaviourist approach that is often adopted in schools, and the messages that come from the top. So, we've got to be brave and think differently.
Thanks, Graham. So I guess From that, I'm thinking about how you do this. Like, what is the work that you do in schools? What's the detail of that?
Most of my work in school is mindset shifting work. And again, my belief is, again, you look at yourselves and you look at situations that we're in, and you'll have a day today of absolutely cooking all day long, and you'll go home agitated and uncomfortable, and you'll probably have a right good go at your other half because you're stressed and you're frustrated and stuff, as good as some of the talks have been. Now, why is it we go home and we take that out on somebody who's had absolutely nothing to do with your day? And the reason that we do that is because that is a person that we feel safest with. That's a person that loves us unconditionally. That's a person that cares about us. Now, we've got so many adults in education who are going home thinking, oh, this child's misbehaviour is because my lessons aren't good enough, or because they don't like me, or because I'm a bad teacher. When in reality, actually, the reason that your other half gets it is because they actually make you feel safe. And so in the world's most backhanded compliment ever, they get the worst of your behaviour because they make you feel the safest. Now, if we're doing our jobs properly in school, we're making children feel safe. If they aren't having that at home and they can't go home and release it, then it stands to reason they will release it at school. And we've got to reframe that behaviour, and we've got to reframe it from an education perspective for these teachers who are going home believing they're doing a bad job. Well, actually, the behaviour probably doesn't have much to do with them at all. And if it does, it might be because they've actually done a really, really good job of making that young person feel safe.
It sounds like a shift in and a challenge to the training that teachers have had. Say a bit about the conditions that you need to develop in a school for this work to land, the cultural changes.
Well, the mindset shift is the first bit. And then we've got to move away from behaviour and authoritarian approaches. You still go in schools now and you look at zero tolerance approaches. You know, the most famous head teacher in this country at the moment has this narrative that children have to be controlled, they have to be coerced. We have a narrative that, oh, we're tough on them because we love them. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. The whole idea that we should do that. You know, the love is unconditional, and if we make it feel like it's conditional, then children will avoid some of those things and go into themselves in that circumstance. If we had a partner and we were withholding that love unless they did what we wanted them to do, that would be deemed as coercive and very negative. And I'm sure Afsal would have something to say about that. But we seem to think that that's perfectly okay within schools, and that's something that really, really concerns me. And it's not all schools, but that when that's the school that's getting the most publicity, people think that's what we have to do. If we've got a narrative of, you know, all poor children have to be saved, then people start looking for a saviour. And people want to take that role. That's not a role that exists. We need to be working with these children to make them feel better and make them feel wanted. And then we can grow resilience and we can grow self-esteem and we can move children out of shame. And these are the things that are driving a lot of those behaviours that we have for our young people. So from a practical perspective, that I think is a starting point, trying to shift the mindset to move away from the behaviourist. And that's not just in terms of negative as well. That's in terms of let's get rid of behaviour charts and attendance awards and all of those different things, because for our young people with low self-esteem, with shame narratives that they believe that they are bad, then that's just highlighting them what they can't achieve. And that is totally counterproductive also. For me, the way I've approached it in terms of a practical sense, in terms of interschools, is through a sort of sequential approach. And it's very much a combination of Maslow's hierarchy alongside some of the work of Dr. Bruce Perry and the neurosequential approach. And the cornerstone for everything, the thing that we can't work without is safety. Because we have to have the frontal cortex working for our young people. And if we don't have them feeling safe, we won't have it. We've then got to look at trust. And a lot of schools are very, very good, especially primary settings, at getting the safety and the trust in place, and then they hit a wall because the next step on that process is for that child to be able to self-regulate. And if that child can't self-regulate because their adult in their life never co-regulated them, that is not that child's fault. And all the parent shaming in the world is not going to teach that child how to do those things. So we've got to teach that. We've also got a situation where children won't be able to belong unless they have the ability to self-regulate. Because children who lash out, other children are scared of them. And if they are walking into a room anticipating rejection, anticipating not being wanted by their peer group, then the safest thing for them to do will always be to reject first. So it becomes a loop for our young people. And we have this narrative about resilience in this country at the moment, and especially after COVID, that children are just magically resilient and they'll deal with the whole... Resilience is built, and if it hasn't been built at home, we've got to build it in school. So if we want resilient and courageous learners, which is what we keep talking about, then we have to build resilient and courageous learners. And just finally on that, the other narrative that's being pushed at the moment is around catch-up and the whole more maths, more English, catch-up is all we ever hear at the moment. But it doesn't matter how many hours we do with children if this is not switched on, and this is not switched on if that child doesn't feel safe. So at the moment, we are pouring all of this extra maths and English into a cup that's still got the lid on, and then wondering why the children aren't retaining the information. If we spend a little bit more time taking the lid off at the expense of actually the hours that we put in, children are going to retain that information, they're going to learn better, and everything's going to be an improvement. And that's the way you get head teachers on board, because at the end of the day, it's a learning business, and we've got to convince the school leaders that the quality of the learning is more important than the quantity a lot of the time.
Thanks, Graham. It's interesting you use the word business there, because I think that taps into a question I wanted to ask about evidence of impact. What difference does this make? And I guess we've heard a lot about, I'm sure that's a question people would ask, we heard a lot from Lucy about the impact of the work that we do, and particularly about costs.
Well, impact-wise, it is incredibly hard, because we're talking about things that are very difficult to measure. You know, there's no standardized test for well-being, and there's no standardized test for self-esteem, and all those different things. And if we do get the improvement in academic, often it's pointed at other things that have caused it, not what I've just talked about. But there's a quote that somebody called Mark Finnis uses, and I can't remember who he stole it off, but that's that not everything that we measure matters, and things that matters we don't measure, or something. I've got that wrong, but something along those lines. But the idea that the things that matter most are the hardest things to measure is absolutely where we are with this. And I think people have tried to show ways of measuring this, and you know, people who are against this kind of stuff take the works of, you know, different, you know, the works of Stephen Perry or Dr. Stephen Porges, and they try to debunk these bits because they're very hard to measure, and we want it simple, and we want those standardized tests and stuff. So the only measure I can really give us, which isn't, you know, is where we're at the moment, is there are schools that are taking a full trauma-informed approach, and they are taking excluded children from elsewhere. They are taking children with more pupil premium, more statements, more all sorts of different things. And, sorry, AACs, not statements, but they're taking more of these young people, and they're still matching up to or outperforming schools that are selective, that are exclusive, and that will, you know, get rid of children that cause them difficulty. So if this doesn't work, then their results would be much lower. Now, I don't know if that's a satisfactory way of doing it. Sometimes you go in with what you believe is right, and that's what those head teachers are doing, because there's no benefit in the current system of being inclusive. There's no benefit for taking those children other than school leaders who know it's the right thing to do. And that's a very sad position to be in, and the days of every child mattering, I don't think we have those days at the moment. Will we go back? Let's hope so, but that's where we're at the moment. So it's in spite of, and the work of, when the adults change is trying to promote that platform to actually, this is the other way. And we have an interesting situation after COVID at the moment where traditionally, especially in secondary schools, there's an acceptance that 95% of the children will succeed and 5% will fail. And the government are very comfortable with this process. And of those 5%, they will struggle in the school and they will be picked up by the pastoral team. And the pastoral team will deal with those children. And it's the same children, repeat on repeat, getting the same consequences, getting the same approach day after day after day. Now, the impact of COVID is that 5% is now 10, 15, 20%. And those pastoral systems are imploding in schools. And so some schools are taking an approach of, we need to be harder, which is meaning we've got more children out of education than ever before. And some schools are recognising we've got to do something different. So if we're offering that something different, then hopefully we can get them on board with that.
Thanks, Graham. Last question from me, and I'm interested in, we've talked about a lot about stories, the stories of children, the context in which they live outside of the school, I suppose. What opportunities in what you're describing to work with a child in their wider familial and other context?
Well, I think if we start this work in school, then we aren't having to do all the work that Nazir's having to do. We have the opportunity. Everybody who's spoken today has talked about prevention rather than cure. Now, yes, it would be fabulous if we could bring back, things like Sure Start and things like that to support even before school age. But at least if we start age 4, then we have a chance to change some of those narratives for those young people and change their destinations, if you like. So if we are working to lift children up rather than knock them down, and we are looking to change those shame narratives that children have developed over their years of experiences, then the hope is that by the end that they avoid that kind of stuff. We had any setting like mine. And I would imagine a number of your people who work with young people, especially in care and things like that, their children will attend a school like mine. And I would be responsible for doing the interviews and getting to know those children when they first come to school. And in front of me was sat a cocky young person who, didn't want to listen and all that kind of. Now, if we look at that and we recognise that actually the best defence against low self-esteem is fake confidence and bravado, we immediately start seeing past the surface behaviour. Now, if we then go from a perspective of this child has been excluded, they've been rejected, their self-esteem is on the floor, that's where we need to start our work. Create safety, and then we'll set about building a self-esteem. If we just see a child that's not interested, that's disengaged, that's work avoidant, then we go about the behaviour, we don't go about the human being. And that's where the difference is. Now, if we have that young person and we do the work that we've got to do, then our end goal, depending whatever time we got that young person, was can they leave us in a position where currently their trajectory is the criminal justice system. Their current trajectory is they won't have successful relationships, they won't be able to hold down a job. Can we embed them with the confidence and the resilience and the self-belief to be able to hold down a job, to be to have a family and to stay out of that criminal justice system. That was our destination and our goal that we were looking for. Now, like I said before, even though we're judged against mainstream schools for our grades, what we found was those children were achieving decent grades because this was working. And that's, again, the same principle. We change the destination for our young people by changing the starting point. And all too often at the moment we have, I often talk about low self-esteem with no support will turn to frustration, will turn to anger, and will end up in aggression. And I'm going to talk about this in my workshop later, but I'd imagine everybody in this room, take the low self-esteem out. We've all done that journey from frustration to a bit agitated, to a bit snappy, to angry. And then we go, no. I'm going to go and walk the dog. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to go and listen to some music, or I'm going to open a bottle of wine, or whatever it is we choose to do in that moment. We have the tools to stop that process and prevent that aggressive action. Now, children who can't do that do the aggressive or the challenging behaviour, and then the last thing they felt was anger. So then we make anger the focus. And when we make anger the focus, we do a very shoddy job of trying to do anger management with that young person, and then that child then walks around telling everybody, I can't control my anger, and I'm an angry child, and it's out of my control and all this. If we do our interventions earlier, then self-esteem becomes the focus. Now, getting them off that process is great, and stopping that train from reaching that destination is great. But actually, if we focus on the self-esteem and lifting that up, then we change the destination. And instead of going to frustration, we go to belonging. Instead of going to anger, we go to self-control. And instead of aggression, we get a happier young person, more resilient young person. So it's where we start the work, and what we make the focus is how we change this for me.
Glenn, thanks very much. I'm going to invite a beautiful audience to ask you questions now. Yeah, you're right, and that's where the problem is, because a lot of what we have at the moment, if you were to take this approach, and those head teachers that have been successful in doing it, they'll tell you it takes 5 years, because you are going to have to change mindsets. You are going to have to convince the children that it's not a fad. You are going to have to have a relatively big staff turnover at that point in time, and if during that process things are going to get worse before they get better, if your Ofsted inspector walks through the door at that point in time, then it's your head on the block as a school leader. And that again is where we're at in terms of the schools that are doing this. It requires an immensely brave leadership. And I genuinely, I wish there was another way around that. I don't think there is at the moment. Like I say, if the message from the top was to change, then I think there might be a bit more openness to this. But where I sort of have conversations with those school leaders is during COVID, schools were getting repeated risk assessment, health and safety guidance. I mean, it literally changed day on day, never mind week on week. And it got to a point where a lot of school leaders went, this is just not right for my children. And they
decided that they were going to do what was right for their children and stop following blindly what they were being told to do. And they were able to do that, and there wasn't, we haven't seen a load of head teachers sacked and things for that. So hopefully that bravery will transfer over. Now, the other thing is, at the moment, like I said before, is what's happening in many schools is the situation is imploding at the moment, because behaviour is being taken away from the class teacher. They're there to teach their subject, not the children. If any child misbehaves, we'll send them out. The pastoral team will come and get them, and then we'll go. But that's not working anymore. So we need something different, and it's getting them to embrace that it can be different. And I think, again, you're trying to show those results, which is tricky to do, definitely. From a class teacher perspective, you need to be confident that you're going to be allowed to prioritise these things, and that comes from that brave leadership to disseminate that down and allow autonomy, allow teachers to make mistakes. If we're going to let children make mistakes, then teachers should be allowed to as well. But the thing that I often find fascinating in schools is when we talk about resources, and we talk about, I'm talking about the importance of maybe positive touch for some young people, the importance of making that child feel heard, feeling wanted, feeling cared for, all of those. The big way in which we do that is how we meet and greet that child and how we make them feel when they walk in that door. And the one thing that every educator can agree on, whatever side of the fence they live, whether they're progressive or traditional, whatever label you want to throw on it, they all agree that the meet and greet is the bit that everybody has to do. Now, when I suggest meeting every young person at that door with their name, with a positive interaction, maybe with a high five or a fist bump or whatever you want to do at that door to make that child feel wanted in that classroom, I'm constantly met with, well, we don't have time to do that. Now, you have time to do a 15-minute equipment check and a uniform check and all of those things before they come in. So it's a bit of again, something that is a bit, it's just narratives again, isn't it? But if I give you a practical example of how in the classroom this works, is if I've got a class of 30 children and in my corner of my eye I notice a child start to escalate, and I've still got a point where this is working really well, and they're still, they're still in the room with me, and I can interact with them. I've got a choice there of, do I stop my lesson for everybody to go and spend 2 or 3 minutes talking to one child or giving that one child a job to do or something like that? Is that fair on the 29 other children? And so we battle on, and we don't stop, and we ignore that low-level behaviour for that young person. But now that young person has switched to a different part of the brain, we're not able to control their emotions anymore. They are maybe gone into some kind of survival response. They're now walking around the classroom. They're now interrupting others. They're shouting over me. They're swearing. They're messing with equipment. Now I've got to stop the lesson anyway, and then I've got to get somebody else to come in away from what they're supposed to be doing and get that child out of that classroom. And then they refuse to leave, and then we have a stand-up argument in the classroom, and then they have to physically escort them. And I look at my watch and I've lost 30 minutes, and everybody has lost 30 minutes. So for me, it's a false economy a lot of the time, this idea that by ignoring that low-level behaviour for that one, that's going to be better for everybody else. It's not. And you look in schools at the moment, the amount of dysregulated young people, the amount of disruption and lost learning time because of that reason, I think we've got to look at it differently, and that's the way we've got to try and sell it, I think, if anything else. Because if it's not broke, don't fix it, but it's broken at the moment, and we've got to try and fix it.
Thanks, Graham. Other questions? I think there's one just here.
I think you're 100% on the money with that, and I think it's multifaceted at the moment, because you've got the Social Mobility Commissioner, massive on parent shaming. You've got the media, love the parent shaming. So parents who are already isolated, ashamed when they ask for help or admitting that they can't cope, so they stop asking for help. If they do ask for help, who do they ask for? Then we've got cultures in schools of, I can't work with that parent, they're difficult to work with, and we end up with that us and them culture that's being pushed by many. So if you're in that position of that parent with all of those different things, then what is your logical conclusion in that situation? I'm not coping. I don't want to ask for help. I can't get any help if I ask for it. Then I will occupy this young person with some technology. I'll sit them in front of a screen. I'll give them an iPad to do, and that'll keep them quiet. That'll give me a little bit of respite and stuff. But then we got children coming to school, age 4, who've never had to wait for attention. They've never had to. They've never been told no. They've been given lots of instant gratification. That's not setting that young person up for a good position to start with. But our attitude then, when that child can't cope, is to then blame home. And we've got to work together and be a team around that young person. And I had some very, very challenging parents. I had some parents who would come very fired up to school. And being a parent of a child with quite significant needs myself, I know what it's like to have to fight every day, to have to go and battle with professionals and stuff. If you've had a negative experience in your own school life, then your issues with authority and your value for school and things like that, you're going to go in there with the same lack of resilience and the same lack of optimism as what the young people have got. We've got to work with those parents the same way we would with the young people. And I've done my fair share of de-escalating parents at the door, and parents that would have been told at a lot of other settings, I can't work with that parent. They're behaving appropriately, or they're aggressive, or whatever. Actually, what the parent that comes to the flying through the door tells me is that they care about their child, and that's a place that we can work from. It's the parents that aren't interested that worry me more. They're much harder to work with. So give me the parent that is angry, and I can work from them. The parents that's disengaged, that's much more difficult to do. Doesn't mean that we can't, but again, we've got to go a slightly different avenue on that. And if I could just, before I take this one last question, just give an example of a young person that I had. And she would come to school, and she would sit in reception. And she'd been excluded 4 times. There was definitely some autism there that had been missed, as it often is with teenage girls. And she'd sit in reception, and that was her attending school. And I would have the job of going and trying to get her to come into school every day. And she was adamant that was it. I'm going to do an hour sat in reception. That's my attendance of school. You can give me a mark, and then you don't get to find my mum. And that was what it was all about, because she had that good relationship with her mum. Now, we worked closely with mum. We worked closely with her. But we still did this dance for about a month. And we had an attendance officer who was talking to that parent on a daily basis, and it wasn't through a blame and shame approach. It was just talking to them, trying to come up with ideas. And I went up to do my usual dance with this young person who would look to give me a load of grief and then hope that I would challenge back so she could then storm off. If it didn't work with me, then she'd try it with a member of the admin team, and if it didn't work with them, she'd try it with a visitor. But somebody would have a pop back at her, and then she could storm out because they were being unreasonable. It was very much a flight response from that young lady. She wasn't in reception. She was in the room with our attendance officer. And so she'd chosen a person to connect to who incidentally was the person that had connected with her mum. And I went in, she expected me to tell her to leave. I didn't. I sat down with them, and that office became her safe place. And she'd do a bit of time in school, And then she'd go to that room, and then breaks and lunches she'd spend in there. And gradually, over time, we got her in full time, and she succeeded really, really well. But if you look at that young person's experiences and their box of experience, bag of experiences they're bringing to school, everything's about failure, everything's about rejection, everything's about it's blame and shame of her and her mum. And that's what she's expecting. So she's replayed all that. She's walked through the door expecting it to go wrong immediately. Now, I've got 3 jobs I've got to do there. The first one is to not put that child on the spot and give that child challenge. Because if that child has got a bag of experiences that is all negative, if I make them reach in that at random and pick out a response, it's going to be a negative. The odds are stacked against me. So if the first interaction with that child that morning is tuck your shirt in, where's your book, where are your shoes, then automatically that child has to reach in and pick that negative, and they're probably out the door before they've even started. The second thing that we can do is we can help them look through the bag to find the positives that exist in there. Reminding them of successes instead of threatening them with failure. Threatening them with consequences is the go-to in any behaviourist school up and down the country. But if I take that child and go, do you remember last week when you did that really, really well? Remember when you were really helpful to Miss the other day? That was fabulous. If I'm helping her to sift through and pick out the positives, then we've got a better chance. But the most important thing I'm going to be doing is building that self-esteem, finding whatever ways I can to add positives in there. And if I can make that happen at home, so instead of a negative interaction about what they've done wrong in school, my phone call home is, they've done this, this, and this really well today. That's what they get when they get home, and that's what becomes important. And it's a drip, drip, drip positive effect rather than a drip, drip, drip negative effect, because that just becomes overwhelming.
Graham, thank you. We're out of time, so apologies for people who still want to ask questions. I know that you did, but you're around for lunch, aren't you?
I will be around at lunch if anyone wants to come and pop over.
Ask your question. Sorry for people online as well. I think the questions one that there. Apologies, online people. I'll look at your questions and I'll answer them. and it's lunchtime. Are there any announcements before?
Thank you.